A fisherman on Lombok found it after a storm, a palm-sized book sealed in salt and pitch, the leather gnawed thin as leaves. Inside, a tidy, empirical hand, on the flyleaf, a name and a year, Charles Dawkins, 1886. No address, no ship, no crew. Only a naturalist's inventory drawn in careful lines and, after that, sentences that begin clear and end in haste. What follows are the first pages. The rest of the notebook will speak later for what this island births in the dark. Reports persist of a land south in the Indian Ocean, mantled year-round by red cloud, a place where birds fall quiet and vegetation feeds on vapors. Colleagues laugh, the barometer does not. The glass sinks, and with it my confidence. If there is such an island, it will reward or ruin more than a hypothesis. The storm lasted a lifetime and then some, taking the ship as a hawk takes a vole. I woke upon black basalt, lips full of brine, my hands bloodless as bone. There is a marsh here, its mouth opening to the sea like a wound. The air tastes of copper. Above me hangs a ceiling of crimson cloud, not sunset but stain, as if the sky were lit from within by a kiln that burns without flame. Silence governs. Not even the comfort of an insect's drone. Plants crowd low to the muck, leaves fleshy as tongues, fronds turn downward, drinking what the ground exhales. In the pools drift green fires. At first I blamed marsh gas, but these flames move against the wind and their light bruises the water. I lowered a jar and drew it up skinned with a film that tingled the fingertips and stung the nose with lemon and sulfur. I will not touch it again. Distances here are treacherous. A hummock that seems a dozen paces away stretches to an hour's walk, while the sea remains audible at my back. Either the land rearranges itself or fear bends space. I note a constant pressure at the sternum, not panic but depth, the sort of weight a diver knows when the sea begins to own him. It is systematic, almost taxonomic, everything seems bred to it. If one could classify such a thing, kingdom, unknown. Phylum, apprehension, one might feel safer. One does not. I first noticed the creature as a glisten along the mud, a dark nude shape shouldering through the duckweed with the confidence of something that has never been taught to hurry. Its skin shone not wet but oiled, the segments of its ribs working under the hide like knuckles, and its eyes were the flat, patient pebbles one sees in shoals at dusk. I remembered then that my notebook and pencil had survived in my pocket, and I crouched to sketch, letting the hand do what the mind could not yet judge. For want of a better word I named it slugamander, more slug than salamander, a thing too viscous for English ponds and too deliberate for innocence. As I drew the blunt head it turned, and with a sound like silk pulled from a sheath it unscrolled a tongue the length of my forearm, tasting the air where my wrist had just been. My reason gave way to instinct. I stood so quickly the marsh spat under my heel, and I backed off along the path with the caution one grants a loaded trap. I fled without elegance and the marsh punished me, pitching me headlong into its black, treacly water where cold rose like hands about my ribs. When I surfaced, coughing mud and salt, two shapes had already gathered, amphibian in the laziest sense, yet wrong in a dozen small blasphemies, one lean as a heron's shadow with lantern eyes and a fence of teeth, the other a wart idol that breathed like a bellows and smiled without mirth. They did not startle, they regarded, and in that mild appraisal I felt the island's argument, that I had come to a place where life had elected other premises than those admitted by our books. I told myself they were only batrachians, relatives by theory to the toads of English gardens, yet their aspect pressed upon me a nausea beyond taxonomy, as though each detail were a deliberate insult to memory. Staggering out, I lurched behind the rot-hollow stump of a dead tree, stripped off boots and coat to steam in the sour wind, and listened until the water forgot my name. Resolved to last the night, I opened the notebook with shaking hands and, by the lantern's bruise of light, sketched from recollection the two obscene species, hoping that careful lines might cage what description could not, until sleep came like a trap closing. I woke with my cheek upon the open notebook, the pencil still in my fingers, to the whisper of wings above the stump and a sight that belonged to Nightmare, a small, hideous thing drifting on leather pinions studded with staring eyes, each iris swiveling in a separate vigilance. It circled once, indifferent to my existence as a stone, and then slipped away into the fern breath of the marsh, as if recalled by some silent order of the place. I raised a hand to pinch myself into certainty when a knife of pain bloomed first. Clinging to my forearm was a pale creature with a tubular, lamprey mouth, its ringed teeth working at me like a pump. I tore it free with a jerk that left a wet pop in the air, and my cry, high and ignoble, rung the forest like a struck bowl, returning to me from hollows I could not see. No beast answered, the silence settled again like ash, and I drank the rain that had pooled in my boots, then steadied my hand to draw the winged watcher and the blood drinker while their shapes were bright with terror. If escape is denied me, then curiosity must be rations and compass both. I will learn what catalogue of horrors keeps house on this unacknowledged shore. It came pulling across the scum like a buoy-grown limb, an absurd, gourd-round beast whose globular body floated while its webbed arms trudged, each step drawing up threads of slime as if the marsh itself were its cradle. Its triangular mock eyes, mere cuts in the rind, offered no gaze to meet, and the wide maw ringed with childish, zigzag dentition opened and shut with a hollow clack that mocked speech. I studied it in its leisure and learned nothing, as if function had been banished by a joke told in a language older than matter. Why should a creature here wear the likeness of a pumpkin, a fruit not born of these latitudes, coincidence, or some deeper parody by which the island apes are knowing? The thought chilled me, that nature here could swerve into farce without losing any of its cruelty, and that this bobbing jester was only the prologue to spectacles for which I possessed no categories, and perhaps no courage. The marsh heaved as if a lung had burst, and from its rent surged a pale worm, 6 yards at least, whose circular maw irised wide and, with a single gulp, swallowed the pumpkin beast, flinging curtains of black water that slapped the rock beneath me like flags of tar. I had not dried, but terror made of the cold and irrelevance, survival, newly humble, seized my limbs, and I snatched up notebook, tins, and lamp like relics ripped from an altar. I ran, the reeds clawing my shins, only to find the way barred by another arm of the mire, a slick channel I had not seen, and as I gathered myself to leap, the surface bubbled and birthed a thing without symmetry, a tumorous congregation of eyes and mouths arranging and unarranging themselves in random jurisprudence. My scalp prickled with the old men's omen, a frost of white racing through my hair, for this vision exceeded not merely expectation but the very grammar of nightmares. Blessedly, the mass moved with a sluggish, tidal indecision, advancing, recoiling, turning from itself as though its thoughts disagreed, and I took that hesitation as my reprieve. Skirting the foul ponds, I forced a path toward the bog forest, where the water lay shallower beneath mats of root and mud, telling myself, against reason, that what is less deep must surely be less terrible. The land rose into a timbered corridor where water ran in a narrow vein, as though I were walking against the artery that fed the marsh. The air was still wet enough to drown a match, yet the menace felt diffused, as rain spread thin upon glass. Here, in the lull, reason returned like a timid clerk and set its accounts in order. The swamps were folly, perhaps merely the island's septic edge, and inland, though strange, might prove less murderous. My heart, flogged by visions, could not endure another revelation like that shambling blob which made a pumpkin seem almost wholesome. While I thought these cowards' hopes, I saw life flank me at a distance, a scarlet, shrimp-like leaper that sprang from root to root with surgical poise, and, farther on, an arachnid enormity crossing a mossed log, each limb articulating with a quiet that bruised the mind. Neither pursued me, yet their silhouettes, angles that had never troubled my dreams until now, taught me that even in this gentler quarter, the island spoke the same language, only in a whisper instead of a scream. The respite shattered with a fracture of dead trees, and out of the wet gloom shouldered a lizard of impossible tonnage, for meters to the crown and so broad-bellied that its scales rasped the mud like a millstone dragged through meal. It did not charge, it merely proceeded, and I, an ant in its isle, learned in a heartbeat that such a colossus has no need to notice lesser faunas or the man who counts them. A chill ran the length of my spine, a presence at my back, so in a fit of uncharacteristic audacity I clambered up the beast's ridged flank and settled astride its heat, turning to see a pale watcher on the path, small, thin-limbed, with eyes like wells that had forgotten their bottoms. Had I remained on foot I think those eyes would have elected me. From the lizard's bastion, the creature only regarded and then seeped backward into the roots, as if denied a ceremony. Carried on that ambulant island of scale, fat and muscle, I let my breath even and watched the bog forest thin, the water drawing away into runnels and the ground rising firm, proof that my unwilling mount was bearing me out of the marsh at last, and for the first time since landfall I felt something like relief remember my name. The great lizard stiffened beneath me, a tremor rippling its cuirass of scales, and for a foolish instant I thought it had only now discovered its passenger. I slid to the ground, and at once met the reek of carrion and the pressure of a presence that made the air granular in my throat. By instinct I turned back toward the drowned forest and there, threaded among the black roots, a grin detached itself from shadow, teeth like old ivory and eyes the color of wet amber, neither beast nor man but some blasphemous compromise that had learned our smile without our mercy. I was frozen a pulse too long, my saurian benefactor had already lumbered out of reach, and the grinning thing uncoiled from its ambuscade with the politeness of a hangman approaching a stool. At last, my muscles remembered flight, and I fled away from the swamps for good, plunging blindly into a dark jungle so hushed and sepulchral that the marsh, in retrospect, seemed almost wholesome. Panting in that funereal green, I thanked whatever governs terror that the smiling entity had not followed, and then understood the worse implication, that even it kept to its own precincts, for what lay ahead was a kingdom more macabre than slime and teeth, yet I had not the courage to turn back, and so I pressed on. Day and night were already quarrelsome under the island's red bruise of sky, but within this dense, morning jungle the quarrel ended in a stalemate where time itself forgot to move, and I lived not by hours but by heartbeats. Since my wreck I have not opened a single tin, everything here, save that colossal lizard, unseasons the appetite, and I would rather starve than eat only to return it to the soil in spasms. I lay hidden in a thicket slick with moss and saw upon a viscous rock two spiderish abominations, each half a meter across, feeding delicately on some amber ooze as if sipping at a sacrament. All at once they scattered like shamed thieves, for down the bole of a tree rushed a paler cousin, thrice their size and armored in bone-pale plates, its mandibles crossing and uncrossing with the rhythm of shears. Terror held me, but it was a measured terror, for I had walked through fouler pageants, the blob in the marsh had already rewritten my threshold, and I knew the smiling thing behind me in memory would not have yielded 1 inch to any spider, however monstrous. I found a mighty fallen trunk, nearly prone and furred with fern, and hauled myself onto it like a sailor to a spar. There, with the canopy strangling the sky to a few dull embers, I at last opened a tin and made a grudging peace with food. From my perch I watched a cat-sized beast squat by a rock, teasing slugs from the loam with a curtain of delicate tentacles, until 2 blind, lipless predators came padding to the rivulet, terrible heads lifted not to see but to scent, and the little diner vanished while the brutes merely drank and slid away. It came to me then that when I am still, the island remembers its native sentence, and that I am the misprint in its grammar. The creatures behave like warders, and their rounds are not for each other but for the intruder who writes in the margins. Later, a red radiance brighter than the ceiling of clouds moved beneath the trees and pooled at the roots of my refuge, and I stilled myself with the care of a held breath. Out of the understory stepped a creature taper large, black as cooled slag yet veined with flowing embers, beautiful beyond anything I have seen here, its hide self-luminous as if lit by molten or beneath. I wondered what charm or blasphemy let it walk this murder garden unafraid, advertising its pulse to every hunter. The glow settled to a gentle smolder and, astonishingly, the beast slept against the trunk. In that warm, reflected blush, I too drifted down, as if some interim truce had been declared between terror and sleep. I woke with a jolt to the wet, tearing sounds of feeding, peered over the ferned rim of my refuge, and loosed, before I could master it, a cry at the sight of a vast, jowled predator swallowing almost whole last night's beautiful, embered beast now guttered to darkness. My foolish voice betrayed me, the brute heaved the carcass back out, its light extinct, and vaulted up the fallen trunk toward me with a speed obscene in something so heavy. I fled, sliding bark, splinters in the palms, and clawed at a tree, gaining only the first branch, while the monster's cavern of a mouth gaped just below my boots, exhaling a graveyard stench that set my gorge to rising until the world tilted like a deck in storm. Then salvation by insult, 2 leather-brown prowlers, smaller, quick as whips, nosed the abandoned prize, and the great jaw, offended in its sovereignty, dropped away from me to punish the theft with thunderous certainty. I did not waste the reprieve, I slid, leapt, and took to the canopy, vowing that henceforth I would travel by the stitched roofs of branches, for the earth of this island is a mouth, and I will not walk into it again. The trees here knit a roof so tight with interlacing boughs that I could go 1/4 of a mile without touching earth, and for an hour I moved through that upper world hearing only the occasional dirge from below, as if all grief on the island were ground-born. With every careful leap the precariousness of my errand grew heavier. I, who had given myself the work of cataloguing, had become a specimen no one would ever claim, an annotation destined to rot between leaves. The very quiet, once mercy, ripened into dread, for solitude lets reason rehearse the arithmetic of doom, the island uncharted, the red fog a lid upon the sky, and even if a ship or aeroplane passed, it would see only a seamless bruise of weather. Still, I pressed on, promising myself that the canopy's crown might offer perspective, but the summit delivered only an infinity of jungle and, far off, a line of mountains whose scale denied the island's size, as though distance here had learned to lie. Close by, a black, naked bird loosed a cry that reached into the gut and untied knots there. I edged lower, preferring a safer height, and turned at a rustle. The bird was already in the mouth of a small, slick-limbed humanoid, jet dark and scarcely a meter high, whose near-human outline burned the eyes with memory of the smiling marsh thing, and I understood that the island does not merely kill, it mocks, arranging its terrors in our image so that we cannot help but dread them twice. The limb cracked and slid me down onto a thicker bough, where my boot sank into something that yielded like warm jelly, a pink, head-sized clot glued to the wood. I could not tell beast from fungus until it quivered awake, unsealing a constellation of black eyes while spider legs unfurled and seized my ankle. A ring of rasping points began to eat through leather and skin, and I struck at it with my free heel in a frenzy that made the gorge rise. After 3 or 4 blows the loathsome mass deflated with a sigh, if such filth can own a breath, and slumped open like a burst organ, slavering the bark with its liquor. Blood warmed my sock and, with it, the realization that this was the first true wound I had suffered. Luck, then, not prudence, had shepherded me thus far. Even as I panted, small 6- and 7-legged scavengers, each no higher than my hand, poured from the crevices and set upon the dead thing, picking it as if they had waited all along for my execution to finish. Up to now I had strained to trace kinships, amphibian to reptile, insect to arachnid, but these 2 latest horrors answer to no branch of life I recognize, and as my foot throbbed like a second heart I felt certain I trod not earth so much as a theater of biology, and I would not remain in this tree to learn the final act. The canopy began to boom like kettle drums, hollow thunder rolling through the vines until thought itself rattled, and I told myself, not for the first time, that I would not discover the source. Destiny, contemptuous, delivered it anyway. A blue-faced ape, vast and rain-slick, hammered its chest before me with a percussion that quivered the bark, so gorilla-like that memory betrayed me with old African comparisons even as my reason tallied the newer, crueler differences. From the gloom came 5 more, hemming me in with slow, deliberate arcs along the limbs. I dared not blink, for their hands ended in curved sabers, and the question of diet, carrion or man, seemed suddenly pedantic. The largest seized me by the ankle and swung me up as a child might a rag, the troop hooting in relish as they tossed me along from branch to branch, the world pitching in scarlet gusts below and a fall of 50 meters opening its mouth wherever a grip might slip. Slip it did, a clumsy catcher missed, and I plunged, through twigs that whipped breath from me, through nets of creeper that slowed me with tearing hands, until I crashed into a buttress of swollen fungi, lives soft as organs that spared my bones but stole my senses, and the red sky folded shut. Time is a ruse among these violet, viscous domes. I woke in their cool reek unsure whether minutes or days had sifted past, grateful to be alive though my foot throbbed with the ape's insult and my ribs chimed from the fall. I understood at once that should flight be required, I would not run. I groped for a staff and found, absurdly for a jungle, nothing straight or sound enough to lean upon, as if the forest had conspired to be all curve and softness. A scritching rose just beyond the nearest toadstool, my saviors rehearsing a second rescue if the hidden author of that noise proved hungry, and I inched forward on my elbows, only to discover that the creature behind the cap had already arranged its gaze upon me. It stood with yellow, moon-wide eyes, a thing between hen and owl, solemn as a magistrate and, I judged, not immediately murderous. I could do nothing clever, so I opened my second and last tin and ate with the discretion of a penitent while it watched. By the time the key scraped the empty lid the bird had vanished without footfall, and I hauled myself out from the fungal grotto, limping but steadied by that thin meal, using the jungle's dense fronds as a screen while I threaded forward into a green that swallowed noise and man alike. I limped on through drifts of fern until a shag of orange loomed from the understory, a 2-meter-high cyclops, for hanging in wet cords, whose single, blinking lens swung past me with a grunt and no more interest than a cow for a fly. Hours later the ankle eased, as if motion itself had greased the joint, and this small mercy had just begun to warm my thoughts when the path folded shut before a crawling abomination, pallid and long-armed, with a second mouth or wound yawning where a crest should be, anatomy that posed questions I had no time or courage to entertain. I was gauging its sluggish reach when the canopy ruptured with wind, and down from a rent of red light stooped a winged blackness, a creature like a funnel with talons, sweeping me into its coil so that the world became leather and breath. Sight failed. If the thing had eyes they were elsewhere, and terror found its instruments in the white nubs that worried at my scalp while the ground let go beneath my boots. In that crush my arm wedged against my pocket, struck metal, and memory blessed me with the absurd, the folding knife I had carried since Sumatra. I clicked it open by feel and punched upward, and the beast loosed me with a shriek like torn bark. I crashed through leaves, bruised but unbroken, and heard below the knife vanish to the forest floor with a final betraying clatter. Grateful to live yet newly helpless, I crouched among the branches and remembered the blue-faced apes, only to sense, in the hush that followed, that in this tier of the world something worse than apes kept its court. I was near the jungle's ragged edge, and with the last tremor of recent horrors ebbing I fixed myself a single aim, get out, and only then decide what to do with whatever waited beyond. That was when I saw it, the most impossible thing yet, a creature black enough to drink the red from the sky, its eyes a pair of nails hammered through the soul, its head vast as my own body and wrong with an alien, deliberate intelligence. The knowledge of being seen by it unmade me. I wept and howled as though my throat belonged to some other animal. It did not pounce, it merely kept its 10 paces, motionless, and terror multiplied in the arithmetic of stillness. Then it moved, slowly, certainly, bearing the stench of funerals, its small pulsing abdomen working like a bellows while those abyssal eyes did not blink. I had already surrendered to death, yet understood that worse than dying would be to touch such a thing, to be admitted into its notice as more than a curiosity. One furred, almost human hand reached, closed with a patient grip upon my arm, and the world folded inward like damp paper as I slid gratefully into blackness, fleeing the only nightmare that could not be outrun. I woke into a grade of confusion so pure it felt medicinal, lying almost whole yet certain some part of me had been removed, and only after long minutes did I understand my eyes were already open. Half an hour later another fact assembled itself: the jungle was gone, wiped as if a wet rag had passed over the world, and I lay on stone beneath a sky redder than any wound. Memory rose in one bruise, the impossible-headed thing, its furred human hand, and with it the suspicion that I had been carried here for a purpose no human verb will hold. Reason, mocked too often, resigned. I accepted that I was still upon the island and yet nowhere recognizably on earth, and the stages of grief, fear, bargaining, rage, collapsed into a quiet denial like snow on coals. From that vacancy my senses reassembled the plain. Far off, two hog-like brutes worried the dust with clacking tusks, and in a rock fissure a small pallid creature watched me with an almost ceremonious caution. I sat upon the overlooking slab, drew out my notebook by reflex, and let the pencil go to work, lines making animals as if that act alone could bottle them, while the red sky pressed down like a lid upon a jar. I was torn from my sketching by a dog-sized wretch whose skin was so thin the bones showed like moonlight through wax. Everything about it felt ill, as though sickness itself had grown a body, and above us the red sky dripped as if about to weep. Its teeth were unequivocally those of a carnivore, and when three others slid from the stones to join it, I understood that arithmetic would soon do what appetite could not, yet I had no compass here, no marsh to skirt nor jungle to thread, only a world I had arrived in without traveling. Before I chose a folly, the ground broke into motion. Two colossal centipedes, glossy and blind, surged from their burrows and seized the translucent pack, drawn, I thought, by some remembered stink, and I did not wait to refine the theory. I left the rock with the steadiness of terror, fixed a line through the desolate plain, and vowed to keep it until it struck a coast, if coast there still was. If I must swim I will, better salt and cold than this constant hemorrhage of crimson and the parade of obscene anatomies. Already I can hear the clean gears of reason slipping teeth in my head, and I know that to linger is to lose the last of them. I came upon another forest, not the fevered jungle of before but a darker, older wood, its boles spaced so that a man might slip and vanish among them, which I did with the shameful relief of a fugitive returning to prison. I knew the paradox, for it was a forest that first unstitched my reason, yet this place breathed differently, and before me a rosy behemoth, for perhaps 5 meters high, trudged with such seismic clumsiness that it parted the way for me like a living bulldozer. From behind us rose a howl that tightened the skin over my skull, and the pink colossus felt it too, lengthening its stride with an unease dreadful to witness in something so vast. The cause arrived like a landslide with teeth, a furred titan 3 meters high, all tendon and rage, rushing us with a cavern of a jaw, and it leapt upon the pink giant, sinking sabers through hide as if through soaked leather. I understood then that my smallness was my brief salvation. While leviathans contended, I was nutritionally negligible, yet their battle shattered trees and air alike until I was knotted among legs and ribs and swinging tails, liable to be crushed by indifferent mechanics at any instant. A stray forelimb caught me and hurled me from the melee. I landed hard, breathless and mottled with new bruises that meant nothing anymore, and lay listening to the forest shake as if the island were trying to shake me out of itself. I had scarcely crawled free of that titanic melee when the air thickened with the thrum of wings, and down through the bleeding sky descended a vision so myth-struck I felt my mind bow like grass before it. A 6-winged thing, too many pinions, too many talons, hovered with a priest's stillness and a butcher's poise, not striking but regarding me, as if I were a cipher to be solved, if there is a God in this place, it keeps such creatures for angels. Everything about it was surplus, excess limb, surplus menace, and yet it held, surveying like a sentinel of some authority beyond matter, as though deciding whether my trespass required report. Then it shrieked, a needle of sound that sowed pain straight through my head, and I broke, I confess it, bolting into a darker quarter of the wood where the light died in ropes between the trees. Even as I ran, I knew it was a ruinous mistake, but the thought came with another, perhaps I no longer choose, perhaps the island, through this crimson seraph, had commanded my panic, and I merely obeyed. It was then that I discovered another bizarrerie, and with it the dim knowledge that some small instinct of survival still trembled within me, the visceral dread of being erased from existence. The creature lurking in a shadowed tract of the forest seemed an anomaly more absurd than the place itself. The fear it stirred was muffled and oblique, not the fear that it would bite or injure me from brutish cruelty, but that such a thing could stand before me and be. It was akin to the terror that felled me at the jungle's verge, and I still could not tell whether I had truly survived that swoon. Before this new abomination I did not know if my soul yet kept me company. The thing advanced slowly while my thoughts congealed, and, rising upon its limbs, it loomed beyond 4 meters. Its eyes never left me, lidless and unwavering, with night pooled in their depths. To look into them was to see, and above all to be seen by the void. A vertigo seized me, not a faint, but the sensation of plunging into that absolute nothing, until from afar there rolled an assonant howling from many mouths, and the tangible world returned to me despite its derangement. What manner of death was I being compelled to rehearse, as if fate amused itself with torments before deigning to shatter its puppet, had it still fouler horrors to display? Then I understood that the cries themselves might be a new peril to confront. A gigantic, pallid creature stood before me, whether it was a fresh monster or the former horror metamorphosed into something more concrete I could not say. The multitude of mouths, each armed with colossal teeth, left no doubt, I was to be torn in pieces and devoured. I screamed with the pallid thing, our cries tearing the world like wet cloth, and from that rip descended a winged demon of many legs, a vision fit for a medieval hellmouth. Formed whole, it circled me in slow, exact spirals. The many-mouthed beast was gone, yet my throat kept pouring air into a single, unbroken howl, a mortuary note that persisted even as breath deserted me. I knew, with the serenity given to the drowned, that this was the manner of my ending. I could no longer breathe, and still I screamed, until the winged devil stooped and covered me like a lid. Then the void, the same I had glimpsed before, received me. I made no sound there, though the noise of my death went on inside like a nail driven through a bell. If I was not dead, I had been emptied. The red mist was everywhere, and I saw it without eyes, without any organ but a consciousness thin to thread. I understood, horribly, that I had been taken into the devil. I felt the weight and reach of its limbs, felt the world through a lattice that was not flesh, while I myself remained only a tenant of dread in its house. This was my second vanishing since the wreck, and more complete. Earth receded as if embarrassed to have known me. As for the notebook, it did not come with me. The creature worried it loose from my coat with a delicacy unsuited to talons, pressed it to the place where its ribs should be, and the red air rejected it the way a body rejects shrapnel. Things of ink and witness are indigestible here. The island, or what rules it, cannot keep what names it. Thus the book was spat back into weather, carried by a tide that remembers what men forget, until some human shore received the only part of me that remained fit for the living, these pages, which are merely what the place could not stomach. At dawn they forced the hut's door. The fisherman lay stiff on the pallet, the notebook open on the table, his eyes, wide and polished down to nothing, as if the creature's vacant gaze had passed through Charles Dawkins's words a century later to enter him. It had reached him not through flesh, but through knowing.